Hello, my name is Andrew Focks, and I am the president-elect of the Ohio Music Teachers Association and president of the Northeast District. During this time when in-person events are not possible, I am very honored to share with you this interview with Robert Levin. Robert Levin is a distinguished concert pianist, musicologist, and professor. His enormous career has taken him across the globe in many capacities, including as a concerto soloist with major orchestras, during which he is known for improvising cadenzas, as well as numerous recitals, master classes, and lecture appearances. He has also served as president of the International Bach Competition and artistic director of the Sarasota Music Festival, and released many recordings throughout his career. After first teaching in the theory department of the Curtis Institute of Music, he has since held positions at SUNY Purchase, the American Conservatory in Fontainebleau, the Staatliche Hochschule für Musik in Freiburg, Harvard University, and the Juilliard School, where he currently serves as a visiting professor. During the interview, we discuss many topics related to his studies with Nadia Boulanger, practicing and preparing repertoire, aspects of performance practice, execution, and expression, advice for students and teachers alike, and more. I hope that you enjoy this interview. So the first question is that following the advice of your teacher in New York, you worked with Nadia Boulanger, I believe, from the ages of 12 through 16. And in an interview with me in 2016 for Clavier Companion, you said that working with Nadia Boulanger was an extraordinary experience in terms of music, philosophy, theology, and spirituality. Can you elaborate on that? What was a week in the life like of being her student, and what can you tell us about those really formative years for you as a musician?
My contact with her began in the summer of 1960 when I attended the Fontainebleau School of Music, also known as the American Conservatory, the Conservatoire Américain. And I attended the school for a total of 5 summers. So from the time I was 12 to the time I was 16. And the amount of contact one had with Nadia Boulanger was partially the result of the course of study that one chose. In my particular case, I studied composition with her, and I studied theory, harmony, counterpoint, later fugue. In the last summer I was there, I also studied organ with her because I wanted to have another opportunity to have a weekly exposure to her tutelage in a different sort of way. In addition to which, she ran classes. There was a class that was called composition class, but was actually an analysis class. She ran a class that was sort of a harmony class, but it was mostly about the preludes from the Bach Well-Tempered Clavier. And we would work on one of them for each of the 8 sessions of the summer. And she also directed the vocal ensemble. So all of the students in the conservatory sang, pardon me, pieces. It could be the Fauré Requiem, it could be the Stravinsky Symphony of Psalms. It was quite a wide variety of things. There were concerts twice a week that were given in the tennis court of the Palace of Fontainebleau. And of course, to be studying in this extraordinary, rich cultural environment of the French Renaissance, the gardens and the architecture was a marvel, and to someone at my age, a really quite exceptional stimulus. And I also, of course, took piano lessons, not with her, but with, there were 2 piano teachers at the Conservatoire when I first came there, Alice Gauthier-Léon from the École Normale in Paris, and Jean Casatsu, the son of Gaby and Robert Casatsu. I ended up working with Jean later, but I worked mostly for the first 3 or 4 summers with Alice Gauthier-Léon, who introduced me to a lot of French music and taught me a lot of things about piano playing from a French point of view, which I had not learned in New York and which are not taught in other places, which was very, very interesting. Lots of things about finger dexterity on the one hand and brilliance, but also a lot of things about sound color and interesting ways of deploying the music between the hands, all sorts of things like that, which were not connected with Nadia Boulanger, but were part of my education in Fontainebleau. So I would be coming in like most of her theory students, and we all bought the Dubois theory, the harmony treatise, And we had figured basses and melodies that we had to harmonize in 4 parts, writing them in open score with soprano, alto, tenor, and bass clefs, which was not such an easy thing to do for a lot of people, but fortunately I had been given prior training in that way, so I was able to do that. And she was extraordinarily demanding of her students. The more she believed in their abilities, the more stringent was her work. And when I came into the private lessons with her, which were, excuse me, on the 2nd floor of the Palace of Fontainebleau, where she had her apartment during the summers, she would often throw daunting tasks at me. She asked me, for instance, to play the Hymne mit Klaviermusik, Opus 37, the first part of the piece. I would have to play the right hand, and she played the left hand, and it's a murderous piece. This. It's Bach with the wrong notes, so to speak. And I was 13 years old, and I didn't sight read it perfectly, and she started punching me in the ribs, because I wasn't sight reading it perfectly, and I started to weep. And when I wept, she transformed herself into an indulgent grandmother, saying, "Oh, no, you must not cry. You know I love you, of course. No, no, please, please." And I'd wipe my ears, and we'd start again, and she'd start shouting again. She expected people to have superbly trained ears. Her assistant, Annette Dieudonné, ran the solfège program there, and there were 5 groups from 1 to 5, in which the 5th group was the least accomplished and the first group was the most accomplished. I ended up in the first group, and then starting in the 2nd or 3rd year, there was a group 0. And the group 0 were the people that she could really just do anything. So she'd tell you, write down this chord, or she'd play a Bach chorale, and you'd have to write down all of the voices with one playing, things like that. And of course, these were all tools. They were instrumental to musicianship, to being able, when you had a clear sense of how a piece could go, you had all of the tools that would enable you to do what your mind imagined, what your spirit was inspired to do. So it was not a matter of simply doing things for the purpose of creating obstacle courses, although the obstacle courses were there. I mean, one time the vocal ensemble was doing the Stravinsky Symphony of Psalms, and she plunked me down at the piano and got out the full score and told me to sight read the full score of the Stravinsky Symphony of Psalms. And, I don't know, it's about 16 or 20 bars before the altos come in and start singing, exaudi, And I was there, and the 60 or so students were in the room, 2 grand pianos there, and I started to play, and she started yelling at me and interrupting me. No, that wasn't good. The chord wasn't balanced right. This wasn't correct. No, I couldn't do that, and so on. The singers waited for an hour and a half, and they never got to sing. It was a bit over the top, I would have to say, but on the other hand, it taught me something about setting the standards. And during the time that I worked with her, I worked through the Dubois Harmony Treatise, I worked through the Dupré Counterpoint course, I worked through Paul Vidal's Figured Basses, which were a means of teaching you basic voice leadings, especially sequences, and you got used to them, and you learned them so that going from one bass to another was not really going from one piece to another, because they were just using over and over again the same kinds of principles of voice leadings that she had described in the sheets of individual harmonic structures that she invented. For instance, for root position triads, there were the so-called cadences. And the cadences were illustrations of what every chord in major and in the 3 forms of minor, melodic, ascending, descending, and harmonic, how they resolved in a tonal context. So for instance, she would say, the major triads are found in a major key on 1, 4, and 5. Now, the major triads in harmonic minor are found in 5 and 6. In melodic ascending minor on 4 and 5. And in descending minor on 7, 6, and 3. And there was a formula for each one of those. So 1, 4, 5. in minor, 5 and 6. In the melodic ascending minor, which you had to have the minor plagal to show that in minor you needed an A flat. Then you have, and she would make you memorize those and being able to play them in any key. Or she would start to play games with them. And she would say, all right, you're going to do all of those examples, but you're going to start on the same chord. So then you'll get, right, that's 1, 4, 5, 1. Now, so if you didn't really have these things down cold, you couldn't do things like that. Then there were she would make you turn the whole thing in. Which put together forms that progression. Then you'd sing one voice, or you wouldn't, and you'd get your ears boxed. And for 6 chords, there was a huge set of voice leadings that you learned. And so on. Dominant 7th chord, same thing. Or you had to take a diminished 7th chord and resolve it to all 12 keys, things like that. The idea, of course, was that no matter what you encountered in a piece of tonal music, you would understand its function, you would understand how it worked, you could understand its voice leading and apply your understanding of voice leading to the expression and the coloristic character of the piece, which was asking a great deal. Unfortunately, a lot of our students went away with only a kind of a sense of the obstacle course, and they went back to the United States and made their students learn all of these formulas, but without making the connection to the literature that is their justification. So, you know, I was lucky that she believed in me and that she spent an enormous amount of energy teaching me. Looking at my compositions, often suggesting the change of a single tone, which would improve immeasurably the piece or cause the whole house of cards just to collapse. Or if I, at one point, had been a little bit lazy or been distracted during the week and took a few hikes too many in the forest of Fontainebleau, which is so beautiful and surrounds the sound, and I found myself with an hour left before her lesson and nothing to show her, well, I memorized a prelude and fugue from the Well-Tempered Clavier so I could play it for her, which was all right. She was happy with that, and she criticized it in many, many useful ways. She, along with Leonard Bernstein, introduced me to Bach cantatas and made that a central repertoire in my own psyche. So, of course, she was Fauré's student, and her recording of the Fauré Requiem is legendary. And thanks to her, her friends and colleagues, Georges Enesco, Arthur Rubinstein, Clifford Curzon, Robert Kasatsu, Henrik Schering, all these people came down and gave master classes and gave performances for us. So for young and impressionable people, this was absolutely extraordinary. But it was really a kind of investment in my future as a musician, which I tend to compare to a magical tool chest, inside of which are all of the kinds of things that you're going to need to become an artist, whether you become a composer or a conductor, or a performer, any of these things. She has given you what you will need. And it may turn out that later on you have a direction in your life that seems to cause you to need something in particular. You'll find it's in the toolkit. In my particular case, when I decided I wanted to improvise in the style of Mozart, the keyboard harmony exercises that she relentlessly forced me to do ended up giving me the materials that I need for all of that. She could be ferocious, but she had an extraordinary sense of humility. Her spirituality, her faith was so glowing that when she played a piece of Beethoven or she played a piece of Bach, you could feel her voice cracking from the depths of the way she was inspired and cowed by the power of the music. And it was something to be a 12-year-old working with someone who was 60 years older, who had that sense of humility, because it showed me that those people who are vain and full of themselves will not enter the musical kingdom of heaven any more than they'll enter the regular kingdom of heaven. So I'm very, very grateful to have had that extraordinary stroke of luck that my solfège teacher and later piano teacher, Louis Martin, who had been a student of Vlado Perlmutter in Paris, where he got his first prize in piano at the conservatory, said to my parents, if you want him to make significant progress, he's got to go to Fontainebleau and work with Nadia Boulanger. And if my uncle had not actually put up the money to do it, it would not have happened. So, you know, those 5 summers at Fontainebleau, and then the adventurous year that I spent alone, living alone in Paris, working with her from age 14 to 15 in 1962 to 1963, that was either going to be, you know, to survive or to perish, because it was very, very difficult living so far away from all of my friends and my family. But on the other hand, it was clear that at the end of that year, I would either realize that my life depended upon being involved in music for the rest of time, or that it was too hot and I should get out of the kitchen. And so it was a rather strange feeling to be coming back to Queens, New York, and going to high school as a senior, where understandably my classmates were really tossing around trying to figure out what they were going to do with their lives. And it was very clear to me what I was going to do with my life. I didn't know exactly what within the domain of music, but music it was going to be. So that in a nutshell summarizes my work with her, a combination of certain routines that were very, very demanding, and as I say, a sense of perpetual inspiration. She would start to teach at 6 o'clock in the morning and go after midnight without a break. You know, a little bit of food might be brought into her. I came in at one point at 5:30 in the morning for a lesson, and she said, you know, she had just been reading the sonnets of Shakespeare, and she was talking about the sonnets of Shakespeare. So heaven knows when she got up or whether she slept at all. Hard to tell.
And so coming out of this extraordinary kind of training, what was it like for you to adjust to life outside of her studio, going back to New York as a senior in high school and so on? Was that a very difficult thing for you, or?
Well, you know, I was studying piano with Louis Martin at that point, and continuing my studies of theory as well. You know, I had some good friends in high school, but I had been living with people 2 and 3 times my age in France, and so the adjustment was a little bit difficult. But it wasn't until I got to Harvard that the enormity of what I had learned in France really hit me, because Harvard was populated. Its undergraduates were, you know, smart people. Obviously, they got into Harvard, so they obviously had a good deal of intellectual chops. And I suddenly became aware of the fact that there were all of these things that I knew and all of these things that I could do that none of my classmates at Harvard could do. They had simply not had that rigorous training. Some of them played the piano very, very well, but they had not been dipped into the profound sense of what music is as poetry and as expression and as drama. And at that moment, there were only 2 things that could happen to me. I could either become conceited because I could do these things that they couldn't, or realizing what an extraordinary stroke of fortune it was that I got this education, and at such a formative age, when I didn't fight it, when it didn't intimidate me, to feel modesty and humility, which is what I did. And my undergraduate years were not simple. Leon Kirchner, the composition teacher, discouraged my compositions. He said that Nadia Boulanger and her teaching was a waste of time, which may have come from the fact that he had worked in Los Angeles with Schoenberg, and Schoenberg and Boulanger were not on the best of terms, of course. But he discouraged me, and I allowed myself to be discouraged, which is my fault. I can't blame him that I ultimately gave up composition, because if I had been a composer and meant to be a composer, I would have fought him and continued to do it. But when I was a senior, I ran into John Harbison, who was a young man at the Society of Fellows at Harvard, and I asked him to show me some of his music, and I realized immediately that he was a born composer. And so it made it much more easy for me to give up my avocation as a composer and to devote my life much more to playing his music, which I've done now for decades, and I'm very proud of the fact that I have. But sure, when I got back to New York, I was a bit of a fish out of water, as you can imagine.
Mm-hmm. So it seems that your piano training at that point was part of a larger music education that you were forming and that you had received. And so at what point did you start to look at piano as a way in which you were, going to really focus your area in terms of piano performance and playing lots of concerts and so on and so forth? When did that shift occur?
That actually happened relatively late. My uncle, who discovered that I had perfect pitch when he came back from 4 years at the Paris Conservatory in the early 1950s, took my musical training in hand because he was the professional musician in our family. He played all of the woodwind instruments. He played flute, oboe, clarinet, bassoon, and saxophone. And so he discovered I had perfect pitch and started looking around to find teachers. And at a certain point, I ended up attending the Chatham Square Music School, which was downtown in Lower East Side of New York. It was founded by Samuel Chatsanoff, who was the music director of NBC when it formed the NBC Symphony for Arturo Toscanini. And he had this wonderful idea of setting up a Saturday music school, kind of settlement music school for people, young people who were not of much means. That is, their parents were not well to do. And at the same time, he would get work for a number of musicians who were stranded in New York in the aftermath of World War II and desperately needed income. And as a result, I was assigned a Polish pianist named Jan Gorbati. I had a solfege teacher who was Seymour Bernstein, who was a famous keyboard educator. And he, when he left Chatham, recommended as his replacement Louis Martin, which is how that happened. And my theory teacher was Stefan Volpe, who ended up being my composition teacher. So that was an extraordinary thing. I was working on composition and ear training and piano at the same time. My piano playing was precocious. I could sight read very, very well, and I got away with murder. In general, I did very, very little practicing, and it showed up in my lessons. And if my piano teacher was aware of that, he didn't say so until I switched to Louis Martin, and I came in the first day and he said, "Well, the party's over." And I said, "What do you mean?" My blood turned to ice. He said, "You've been getting away with murder all of these years. You've been fooling everybody, but you don't fool me. You haven't practiced an honest day in your life. You have no fingers. You're going to have to really get to work." And I swallowed hard and realized, of course, that he was absolutely right. And so he made me start to work on scales, arpeggios, etudes. One year he said, "You don't know anything about 20th century music." So I spent a whole year playing Bartók and Schoenberg and God knows who else, the Webern variations, Stravinsky. It was a revelatory year for me. And when I was at Harvard, I did my academic work, and I worked at the Harvard radio station where I became chief producer and program director. And I used to joke to my friends that whereas most of them practiced in order to play concerts, I played concerts in order to practice, figuring that if I didn't commit myself to giving performances, I would not force myself to sit down and learn what needed to be done. And I played mostly chamber music. In fact, I didn't play a single solo recital in my life until 1974, when, hard to believe, I was almost 30. And I did so because I was supposed to give a concert with my ex-wife, Christine Whittlesey, at Fontainebleau, and she lost her voice a couple of weeks beforehand. And so in order to fill in the gap, I offered Nadia Boulanger a solo recital in which I played the concert, half of which was music I knew she'd like and half of which I was pretty sure she wouldn't, which meant Mozart and Stravinsky among the likes and Brahms and Harbison among the dislikes, and I wasn't wrong. But, and this is germane to your question, she came backstage to me afterwards and she didn't waste a word. She looked at me straight in the eye and she said, when you came to me for the first time, and that was 14 years prior to that, when you came to me for the first time, it was obvious that you were a born musician, but it was not clear whether you were a pianist. You are a pianist. And she hugged me.
Wow.
And that was a turning point in my life. And I thought, if she really believes in me, then this is something I really need to do. And I ended up playing a lot with the New York Philharmonic Chamber Ensemble with the likes of Felix Galimir and Isidore Cohen and John Graham, Kim Kashkashian, Tim Eddy, Samuel Barron, Ronald Roseman, amazing musicians, Alvin Braham, the great bass virtuoso. And so I was playing regular subscription concerts in New York all of the time. And gradually I started playing orchestral appearances, lots of concertos, fewer solo recitals, but they came along afterwards. And in a way, it was not such a terrible thing that it took me that long to immerse myself in a solo career, because it gave me a lot of time to think about things and to think about what I wish to express and why I would have something to say which maybe someone else might not. And so by the time in the 80s, people got interested in what I had to offer, I had had enough time to mature, to develop, and to get a message. And I think that was helpful, rather than practicing 12 hours a day, going out to the international competition circuit and trying like a blazing meteor to capture the imagination of the music mafia. So that didn't happen to me. It happened quite late, and I don't regret it.
So related to this, can you tell me a little bit about how you do practice? So when you work on a new piece of music and you prepare it for concerts or recordings, how do you work? How do you break things down? How do you problem solve? And related to this, as a teacher who travels all over the world, what are some of the main issues that you see in the way that some other students practice?
Well, one of the things that I learned when I was young, and since I should point out that I took my last piano lesson at the age of 16, which was a big mistake, but when I got to Harvard, I thought I'd have to do academics and so on and do some piano playing on the side, but I wouldn't have time. Whereas classmates of mine like Ursula Oppens and Philip Moll were studying with Leonard Schurer and other luminaries of the Boston pianistic scene. I was not doing that. So I had to teach myself things that others were not teaching me. And I began to realize some interesting things about the physiology of playing the piano. One summer, I was in upstate New York living with some friends, and it was in a time when everybody was jogging. And I would drive the car to the high school nearby, and I'd go around the track, I don't know, a certain number of times. And the first or second time I did this, I jogged around and went to the car, got into the car, and drove the car the 5 blocks home. And I tried to get out of the car, and I couldn't. I simply couldn't lift myself out of the seat. The only thing I could do was to push on the steering wheel and use the pressure on the steering wheel to get myself up so I could leave. And I thought to myself, what's this about? And I thought, I know what it is. I'm not winding down. I'm doing maximum muscular exertion and then stopping, and the body goes into a kind of spasm. And suddenly I thought, I wonder whether that might be applicable to piano playing. Because with my lessons from Louis Martin, I did what everybody did in practicing scales. You'd put the metronome on 60 or 63 or something like that. And you'd play a note to the click, and then you'd play 2 notes to the click, and then 3, and then 4, and then 6, and then 8. And then you'd stop. And then you start to play some music. And I realized it was exactly the same thing. If I started slowly and I went up to the top and then I went back one rhythm at a time until I was back at quarter notes, my fingers and my technique was completely limbered up and I was ready to do anything I wanted. And I also began to realize that if I wanted to strengthen my fingers, that I needed to practice slowly, which is something that most pianists are too impatient to do. Their idea is to try to play any new piece as quickly as possible. That is, bring it up to tempo as instantaneously as they possibly could. And I developed a regime in which I decided that I would need to teach my fingers to work, but also to relax. Because to work all of the time is to present a certain amount of strain. And if you don't balance that with winding down, you can get tendonitis. You can get all sorts of muscular disorders. So I got the idea that I would put the metronome on 60 and I would play one note for every 2 clicks, which is very, very slow. But what I would do was push with pressure for 1 second and then let go for 1 second. Which means, of course, you have to be concentrated enough to realize whether you are relaxing or not. The mere fact that you're not pushing doesn't mean that you're relaxing. You have to be absolutely sure, and if you can't do that, then you're going to have to go even slower. It's a radical idea, and everything that you do is going to be work, relax, and so on. But all of the changes of position, when you bring your thumb under, for instance, are to happen presto in real tempo. Because later on, when you're playing presto, you will not be able to control anymore whether your thumb goes under at speed. And most people, when they play, they start 2, 3, and slowly, begrudgingly, the thumb goes over, or the 4th finger comes over when you come down. So it took me a while to understand this, that the combination of making the motions, the coordination motions, well-oiled, light, easy, and healthy, whereas working that way, going up, as you go up from 1 note for 2 clicks to 1 note to 1 click, you're now working for a half a second and relaxing for a half a second. That's actually quite virtuosic. You have to give your mind, and this is especially true when learning new music, your mind has to be able to define in advance what you want. What do you want? Do it. And then, did you do what you wanted? And if not, why not? How do you need to correct that? It takes a great deal, an enormous amount of concentration. Nadia Boulanger used to say to me, any pianist who concentrates completely and takes responsibility for everything they do as a pianist cannot practice for more than 2 hours a day without utter exhaustion. The people who practice 10 hours a day have their brains turned off. And there is some truth to that. So the idea that you're going to work for a second and relax for a second, then you're going to work for a half a second and relax for a half a second, you're going to work for a quarter of a second and relax for a quarter of a second, means that as you go faster, an exercise in strengthening your fingers becomes an exercise in dexterity. So by the time you're playing 8 notes or 6 notes to a click, you're whipping along like this, using the strength that you acquired at the slower tempos. Now, as far as learning a new piece is concerned, and of course, you've got to be very careful, because if what you do is you pressure but you don't relax, you're going to tie your fingers in knots, and you're going to get a difficult physical situation. So this is not for people who are unable to concentrate. If you're unable to verify whether you're doing the relaxation as well as the work, then this is not something for you. In fact, it's quite dangerous. And in general, when I teach master classes, I'm loath to give this kind of information to young people, because it's like a doctor who is visited by somebody who's traveling, and the doctor prescribes a medication and doesn't tell you about the side effects. And then you're in another country a week and a half later and something's going wrong, and the doctor doesn't know what happened because he doesn't know what you took. So it's very, very important for people to understand that they have to take responsibility for what they do, because most young musicians that I know, and pianists in particular, practice reactively. They play something and they don't like it, so they do it again and again and again. And most of the time, they don't even ask themselves, what am I going to do differently now, which is going to make the difference between frustration and mastery? And if you don't change something, we get back to the famous remark of Albert Einstein that lunacy is doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different result. And if you believe in Einstein's saying and you walk down the corridor of a typical school of music, you would assume that you're in an asylum. Because what do you hear people doing? They play it over and over, and then finally the 49th and the 50th time, it's okay. And they think, okay, it's good now. Well, if 2% is good enough for you, you know, maybe it is. But for most of us, 2% isn't good enough. So the thing that is, I find useful is that everything should be done in the most efficient way possible. And that means do not, when you learn a new piece, propose to learn the notes at a speed that you cannot pick up 2 hours, 4 hours a day later, exactly where you were. And most people, they will practice, they'll put their Liszt Hungarian Rhapsody on the piano and they'll work for 45 minutes and they can play the first 3 pages at tempo. And then the phone rings and they go to the phone and they talk for 20 seconds. And they come back to the piano and they can't play anything. I mean, there's no pianist who's honest who won't confess that that happens. Why does it happen? It happens because of short-term memory. If you practice a passage 50 times, your fingers will be able to do it because they're in a rote pattern of short-term memory. But if, having had the 20-second tough phone conversation, gone back and discovering you can't do it at all, and you spend another 20 minutes, now it's fine, and then you go into the kitchen, get a drink of orange juice, and you come back and you can't do it again, it's time to ask yourself, what's going on with your wasted time? So it's not really useful to get things up to speed as quickly as possible. You know, nowadays when we dial a telephone number, we do it on a smartphone. So we don't have to remember it in our head. It's not, even our short-term memory is coming a cropper. But you know, in the old days, you'd look up a number in the telephone book, you know, you call the rental car agency and change the rental time for your car and says 1-800-725-4391. 725-4391, 725, it's busy. 4371, 925-4371, still busy. 925-4371, Hertz, yeah, can I, fine, good. What was the number? I don't know. You see, and that's what people are doing at the piano. They're pushing themselves to maximum achievement in the shortest amount of time, not realizing that most of that time is going to be wasted. And it will take maybe the 3rd session or the 4th or maybe 5th session before it sticks. And you know what's the worst part of this? The worst part of it is what happens when you learn the 4th Ballade of Chopin. And that happened. And then you learned it again and learned it again, and learned it again. It was fine. And you played it and it was great. And then a year goes by or 2, and somebody calls you and says, you know, I was supposed to play the Chopin 4th Ballade. You know, I can't do it. I injured myself. I'm not, could you come in and play it for me? You say, yeah, sure, I can play that. And you open up the music and there are your fingerings and so on, and you look at it and your fingers say, I don't know what you're talking about. You know, they don't remember. You're starting like Sisyphus at the bottom of the hill with a big stone. And then one is, you know, one is obliged to ask oneself an embarrassing and devastating question. What is this thing we call repertoire? Repertoire is something that you've got in your fingers and you can't take it away. Repertoire is when I played the Mozart 21st Concerto on the forte piano together with the Mozart A Major Rondo, which I learned in a day and a half because the singer was unable to sing. And the following morning, I got a call from the Boston Symphony asking me if I could play Beethoven 4 with Ozawa because Brendel had been forced to cancel. That's when you find out if you have repertoire. But the amazing thing, Andrew, is what you learn slowly, you have forever. So if you have the self-restraint to start your 4th Ballade and not take it maybe more than 50% of tempo the first day, the next day you'll come in, you'll get it up to 65. The next day it'll be up to 80. The next day it'll be up to 95. And then if that person tells you to sub for them, you'll sit down and you'll start to play at 50%, and your fingers say, yeah, right, yeah, I got it, yeah, I remember this. And then within hours, the whole thing is up and running. I can't imagine why anyone would want to do it any other way. But what it does is it deprives you of the gratification of playing as fast as possible, as soon as possible, which really isn't what art is about. So that's the advice I would give to people. Slow down, think about everything that's worth thinking about color, about character, about drama, declamation, think about your fingerings, all of the things that you need to think about, and make an investment for your life. Understanding that what you do, if you do it well and you do it with responsibility, with care, and above all, starting slowly, you will have for a lifetime.
Yeah, thank you for that. I agree completely with everything you said, and I think it's really good advice for all of us to keep in mind. I know that another area that our members had asked about was some areas of performance when it comes to execution of certain principles, because I think a lot of students are unsure of themselves when it comes to this. And so I wanted to ask you what some of the primary issues you see when it comes to performance practice that you wish students were more familiar, whether it's having to do with when to play triplets when they're written as a dotted rhythm, or when to begin Mozart trills on the main note instead of the upper note, or what are some of the areas that you wish people knew more about when they tackle these issues as they come up in repertoire?
Well, the first thing I would want to say is that very often people say, there's no way to know how to play Bach. I mean, nobody agrees about it. And my answer to that is, you're not looking. We're very lucky in that we have all of these fantastic treatises. In the 18th and early 19th century, musicians were very eager to tell other musicians what to do. And what they're concerned about mostly are these questions of execution, of fingerings, of ornaments. And all of books. We have Carl Philipp Emanuel's Bach's book on the true manner of playing the keyboard, which sums up all of the teachings of his father, because his father was basically his sole tutor. And if you read Leopold Mozart's violin book, he was Mozart's only teacher. So you can learn from the son of the father and from the father of the son. And there's Kwanz's book on playing the flute, there's Türk's book on playing the piano. All of these things contain a huge amount of information on just what you're talking about. And they simply resolve these questions once and for all. One needs to be curious enough about how people did things in a bygone era, because you feel more and more comfortable about speaking the language of the composer if you get the dialect right. I mean, in a sense, you can say, how important is it if you start a trill on the main note or an upper note, it goes by in a twinkling of marjoram. Who cares about whether it's tarragon or dill? Yeah, it makes a difference. I mean, if you're a cook, you better know the difference between those two things. And so these kinds of information are available in the treatises, and I really recommend, and in good English translations, by the way, and I recommend young musicians to take the time to do these things, because it's not that hard to do. But to mention some of the things that you talk about, trills are normatively played in the 18th century on the upper note. In the late 18th century and into the early 19th century, there emerged certain cases in which, for reasons which are generalized and not specific to individual pieces, which would cause you to play on the main note. For instance, if you're playing a chain of trills. Emperor Concerto. But not in which each one of the trills sticks out like a store thumb. So, or if you're going up a scale to a trill, but not not. One of them is missing a tooth and the other one stumbles, you see? So those are general principles that are, in a way, artistically self-evident. There is the principle which you and I have talked about at other times, the so-called main note, the repeated note, main note, trill rule, which says that if you are repeating a note and you have a trill on that same note, that you will play not. And in that particular case, actually, Beethoven tells you to play with the upper note. So the normal execution would be that, but he wants this. And in order to tell you that he wants that, he has to write the grace note. This is what I call the bounty of negative information. You look at it and you say, Beethoven is asking me to do something that I'm going to do anyway. If he's telling me that I should play these trills on the upper note, but I'm taught to play them on the upper note, why is he telling me? There can be only one reason. He's telling me this because he fears that if he doesn't tell me, I'm going to do it wrong. That is, I'm going to play it with the main note. And he wants it to be otherwise. And that must mean that somebody looking at that passage would normally play that trill on the main note and not the upper note. So that's negative information. By Beethoven's telling you to do something that you would normally not do, he's telling you the exception instead of the rule. When Czerny says, don't he says, don't play the 16th note together with the triplet. And most people say, hey, well, who does that? You say, wait a minute. Why is he telling you not to play it with the triplet? Because he fears that if he doesn't tell you, you're going to play. You see, so he tells you that you mustn't play it together because he wants you to play it not together, which means that everybody normally would have played it together.
Is that also true for when a rhythm would appear without, let's say, triplet underneath it first? For instance, in the slow movement of the Beethoven C major concerto, we do get a eighth note with a 16th note figure, but then it comes back later in the movement, but this time it has chords underneath it. And so many people now transform that to a triplet. Is that true?
All you have to do is look at the manuscript and see that the notes are aligned vertically. And I believe that, with Schubert, this is a big issue too, that in general, when you write notes above one another, then you play them together. You know, Chopin. He writes dotted eighths and 16ths, lines the 16ths absolutely up. And when he doesn't want them together, he writes a double dotted eighth and a 32nd. So one of them is a triplet and the other is a sextuplet, which shows you that this principle of triplet execution with dotted rhythms goes on. And it goes on through Dvorak. It goes on even in Schoenberg, in the Kammersymphony. You know, I mean, who knows? Maybe not, you know. I mean, that's awfully close to the present day. And so some people say, no, that goes too far. Well, maybe it does, but the heritage is there. And so, as I say, when Czerny says, don't align the 16th of the dotted eighth and the 16th with the triplet in the Moonlight Sonata, it tells you something about the relationship between convention and that. And of course, what that's about is that the tempo is so slow that you wouldn't opt for triplet execution.
Mm-hmm.
But once again, I mean, for people who say, well, that's fine, you know, thank you for telling me that, I'll try to remember it. But I mean, how am I supposed to remember stuff like this? What if I forget it? Is it, read the books are there. I mean, you'll find this in Turk, you'll find it in C.P. Bach and so on. And it's not something that you need to read and memorize. You just leave it on your shelf, and all of a sudden you say, hey, what do I do? Oh, pull the book down from the shelf, go to chapter 2, there it is.
You had mentioned Schubert a moment ago, and I wanted to ask you just one question about that, which is there seems to be a consensus that when Schubert writes a diminuendo, it also equals a bit of a retardando. Versus when he writes decrescendo, it does not imply that. And I know there are examples in the late Schubert sonatas, like D894 and 959, for example, where one can find an a tempo written after a diminuendo, which would seem to prove this. But I'm wondering if the principle applies retroactively to earlier Schubert pieces, or are there examples of this in earlier Schubert as well?
There are examples of it. You know, I mean, what always interests me is how does a composer develop a particular personal notational tick? You know, how is it that when Brahms writes sostenuto, he wants you to play slower? Whereas when Chopin writes sostenuto, he wants you to play in a more sustained and with a richer, deeper sound. So the one size fits all, when we go to school, we learn musical terms, and unfortunately the terms don't apply equally to individual composers. In the case of Beethoven, Beethoven writes decrescendo for the first part of his life and diminuendo for the second part of his life. Therefore, I think it's probably justifiable to assume that there's no difference for him. There's just a moment when he changes his terminology, but he doesn't mean anything different than getting softer. There's only one case that I know where there's a decrescendo, and it's in, I think, the second variation of Opus 109, the E major sonata in the last movement, where there are two 16th notes where he actually has a decrescendo and not a diminuendo. So, you know, what are you going to say about that? Maybe just that the exception proves the rule. But Schubert, which if Schubert had written diminuendo for half of his life and decrescendo for the other half, then we'd say, okay, that's not of any significance in terms of performance practice. That's just at a certain point, you know, you go to school and you have a penmanship which is like this, and you see a friend of yours and he likes the fact that he writes E's, you know, in the Greek way, like that, instead of with the loop. And so you start to do that. So maybe, you know, Schubert ran into somebody and he saw them doing something, and he could say that would be the answer. But in fact, it's true that Schubert does not always write a tempo after diminuendo, but he does it frequently. And second of all, and equally important, you can predict with a large degree of accuracy when he's going to use diminuendo. At the end of the exposition, at the end of the movement, at the end of the development before the return, where the music is winding down. And it makes a great deal of sense. I know that David Montgomery, the Schubert scholar, has claimed that these two things are completely interchangeable, but that creates a greater problem than it solves. Why on earth would a composer use two completely interchangeable terms for his entire creative life? The idea of a notation is to try to help performers understand your music and play it properly. Using two words where they mean the same thing does not help. There's no advantage to doing that, and therefore there's no justification.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah. We've been talking for the last few minutes about a lot of principles with execution. I was wondering if you could briefly speak about the relationship between principles of execution as it relates to expression of music.
This is a long-standing discussion. Most of the earlier treatises, 17th, 18th, early 19th century treatises, they talk about execution, which is essentially pronunciation. They tell you how to execute trills and turns, appoggiaturas. They tell you all of these things that are necessary for the proper declamation. In other words, execution involves every aspect of a performance which is not specifically related to a particular dramatic situation. That is, you don't play it that way because you're angry, because you're ecstatic, because you're suspicious, because you're brooding. The trill is a trill, and that's what you're going to do with it. So that's execution. Expression is everything which follows from the dramatic context. And most of the time, when you read these treatises, they will tell you about execution, and then there'll be something very brief about expression, saying that you have to, of course, express the proper character of the piece and so on. But essentially, they've got confidence that their readership will understand expression. And you mentioned this earlier in the interview. The person who really nails this is Gustav Schilling, who in 1838 in his music lexicon says essentially, it is possible to perform a piece with correct execution throughout and not achieve the proper expression. But the reverse is not possible. And this infuriates musicians of our time because they think everything is about expression. You know, why are you getting all messed up about this trill or this ornament over here or this fermata and so on and so forth? I mean, can I just do what I want? You say, well, you can do it what you want, but then maybe you're not actually playing the piece. At what point does your just say playing loud instead of soft, fast instead of slow, you know, at what point does that make the piece almost unrecognizable? So yes, I use the example, please save her, it's my mother. You see, it doesn't matter how, you know, overwrought you are about the idea that the villain is going to kill your mother. If you mispronounce the word, it doesn't matter how expressive you are, it's ludicrous. But unfortunately, people who don't understand the relationship between the rhetoric of the piece and the execution of all of these things will not see that it's terribly important to understand how to do these things, because they give you a clue to the character of the piece. And certainly, I mean, a composer like Beethoven or Schubert evolves enormously in the course of their lives, and you see things happening in their music, and you want to be on top of those things. You want to respect those things. But the idea is, of course, I mean, Mozart once said the art of sight reading is to play a piece of the proper tempo and then the proper style and so on, in short, in such a way as to suggest that one had composed the piece. Well, if sight reading, you know, should be played as if you were the composer, what's performance? At the very least, it seems to me that you have to immerse yourself in the drama and in the character and understand, just as a great chef understands how flavors have to be exquisitely balanced, that the way you execute a piece of music has absolutely indispensable effects on how the audience perceives it and how the message gets sent out. Because performance is an act of communication, and therefore what you communicate and how you communicate it is absolutely essential.
In the past hour, we've already covered so many topics and so many different conversations about many things. I was wondering, both as a musician and as a person, if there were some things that you know now that you had wished you had known younger, both as a musician and as a person.
Well, I come back to the sense of humility that one experiences when facing great masterworks. And I was extraordinarily fortunate, as I've said, to come into contact with some great, great musicians when I was very, very young and, you know, influenceable, you know, that what they presented and how they did so had an absolutely shattering effect on how I looked at these things. I mean, to have watched Leonard Bernstein's television broadcast on the music of Bach in February of 1958 and to have become a Bach fanatic immediately, pestering my father until he would go out and buy every recording of every Bach cantata that you could get, which at the time was about 12, or persecuting my uncle until he took me to a music shop on 48th Street in New York, where I could buy miniature scores of every Bach cantata that was available, which were about 12 out of over 200. And then a friend of mine in France introduced me to Blackwell's music shop in Oxford in England, and I started ordering my music from Blackwell's rather than from New York. And in 1961, their biannual bulletin announced the publication of the complete works of Bach, a new Bach edition. And I fell to my feet in front of my parents and I said, please, please, I have to have this. I absolutely have to have it. And they said, we can't afford it. I mean, you know, it was expensive. The equivalent today of $250 a volume, you know. My uncle said, I'll do it. I'll do it. And 3 years later, I persuaded them to subscribe to the Mozart edition. And that was followed at a certain interval by the Schubert edition, and later the Schumann and Shostakovich and, you know, Mendelssohn and so on. So you've been in the house, you know how the bookcases are full of these things. Anyhow, you know, there are a lot of things I wish I had known when I was younger, but in a way I have few regrets because I kept my spirit open and was constantly receptive to things. I mean, what an extraordinary experience it was when, being now the editorial chair of the Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach edition, which is being published by the Packard Humanities Institute, and which, by the way, is available free of charge on the internet. You can spend $200 a volume and get it in cloth, but if you want to just print it out on your local printer, you just can go to the CPEB, the CPE Bach Complete Works, and you can get everything. And I was assigned to do the volume of Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach sonatas with varied reprises. I did not know them. All I knew his Prussian and Württemberg sonatas. I knew his amateur and connoisseur sonatas, the Kenner and Liebhaber collection. I knew his fantasies, but I did not know these pieces. And when I looked at them, my heart skipped a beat. Because what he basically says is everybody knows that when you take repeats in sonatas, you're supposed to vary them. But people don't know how to do it, so I'm going to show you how. And he writes these sonatas, and instead of having a repeat sign of the first half and a repeat sign of the second half, he writes it all out and recomposes it. He retells the tale using completely different vocabulary. And when I realized the influence that C.P.E. Bach had on Haydn, on Mozart, and on Beethoven, I realized that I had been playing this music completely incorrectly. And alas, that all of us are playing rather incorrectly. And this happened just in time for me to record all of the Mozart piano sonatas on his own piano in Salzburg, when I was able to, in the repeats, to retell the story. And I don't mean just by putting a turn here and a trill there and an appoggiatura there, but really retelling the story with, you know, there is this difference which is made in the German treatises between voluntary and involuntary decorations. And involuntary decorations are the ones that are expressed by symbols, the turn signal, the trill, and so on, which are invariable in their execution, and that's the way they go. But voluntary ornaments are free melodic ornaments. So you see this. That's an involuntary ornament. That's quite voluntary. So I began to realize that this was a major discovery that I made about 3 years ago. So I guess I'm not entirely embarrassed that I didn't have the answers at that time, because most of my colleagues play Mozart in a very pietistic way. With Haydn, there's more ornamentation that's written out. With Beethoven, maybe a little bit, but there's still room. I mean, I'm not suggesting, for heaven's sake, that you play the Hammerklavier with all sorts of whipped cream. I mean, there comes a time when the composer arrogates the creative process to her himself and wants you to pay attention to what he's written.
Thank you. Yeah. Our final question for our members for you this afternoon is, during this particularly difficult time that we find ourselves in summer of 2020, we were wondering if you had any thoughts or advice for how to carry on as artists, as pianists, as musicians, in light of what we find ourselves in right now.
Well, it's an extraordinary opportunity that one rarely has to make an investment in one's artistic future. Books to be read, new repertoire to be studied, challenges made to one's imagination, listening to recordings that one is not familiar with. There's so many ways that one can expand one's perspective. And later on, when things get back to normal and one faces the deadline of performances and traveling and so on, those things will probably not be possible to that degree, and taking a sabbatical will be a hard-won kind of victory. So, I mean, I'm using it to write a book on the Mozart piano concertos. And I would urge your listeners to look at ways that they can expand their knowledge, their understanding, and above all, their inspiration by looking in directions that they hadn't before. If there are people who are mostly interested in classical and early romantic music, well, they should look at some Russian music. Let them look at some Spanish music. Let them look at some Italian keyboard music, of which there is a lot of interesting stuff. There's so many areas in which all of us can stand to broaden our knowledge. And if ever there was an example of the adage that when fate deals you lemons, you make lemonade, it seems to me this is one of those moments. And especially considering the fact that although I don't entirely approve of it, we have IMSLP. So even if because of the coronavirus, we are daunted about going to libraries and it's not so easy, you can still get online and print out some music and get to know it more carefully. So I would urge people to make an investment in their own future by creating the conditions from which, when performances are again possible, that they have all sorts of exciting new discoveries to offer their public.
Great. Thank you so much for doing this. We so deeply appreciate your time, your insights, your experience, your knowledge. It's really humbling and a wonderful thing. So thank you very much for doing this today.
My pleasure, Andrew.